Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending the Independent Trustee Alliance webinar series. Today's topic is a framework for good fiduciary practice presented by Lindsay Pope of Trustee Support Limited in Auckland, New Zealand. My name is Kevin Quinn. I'm president of the Independent Trustee Alliance, and I'll also be the moderator for this session. Please hold your questions or type them in the chat box so they can be addressed at the end of the presentation. A recording will be available. And one note, it is easy to unmute yourself. Everybody should be on mute right now, but I will be trying to monitor and keep the background noise of the other lines silent. If you have any technical difficulty, please use the chat box to communicate. The ITA is a professional association formed by trustees who work independently or for family offices, fiduciaries, and other family consultants. We believe the independent trustee is a rising profession, though one that leaves many people asking, what is an independent trustee and how can I be assured you know what you're doing? Thus, the objective of the Independent Trustee Alliance is to raise the awareness of the profession of independent trustee through marketing, continuing education, workshops, and conferences. We'll shape the future by educating, training, and certifying the professionals of today and tomorrow, as well as family members and even beneficiaries. Our lofty goal is one day advisors will say to their clients, you need an independent trustee, and that independent trustee needs to be ITA certified. Membership in the Alliance is open to anyone who wants to now or in the future be an independent trustee, as well as those in related professions who support the concept. For more information, please visit trusteealliance.com or visit us on LinkedIn. As we begin, a reminder, information presented in this webinar is not to be construed as legal advice. So let's dive in. As you can see, Lindsay has worked in this space for many years, and he's also a charter member of the Alliance. Lindsay, with so much experience under your belt, why did you get involved with the ITA?
Thanks, Kevin, and good morning from where I am, or good afternoon, evening, wherever you may be. I first got involved with the Independent Trustee Alliance at the Purposeful Planning Institute a couple of years ago when this was just an idea. And the reason I became involved because it's an area of work I'm passionate about. And I saw the Independent Trustee Alliance could do two things, was raise the standards and practices of independent trustees, but also help those independent trustees to take a leadership role in the industry in raising trustee standards with others that they may be working with as co-trustees and championing better practices. So that's why I became involved, Kevin.
All right. Well, thanks, Lindsay, and thank you for putting together and presenting this material today. Ready to begin?
Ready. So if you turn the slides.
There you go.
Thank you. In my practice here in New Zealand, I work with a lot of professional independent trustees. We've got new legislation on the books coming up here, and it's meant that professional independent trustees are acutely aware of the need to be on top of their game. The hard part for many of those trustees is figuring out how best to do it. When I've spoken and met with trustees, two themes kept coming back. Two questions continued to be raised, and one was that, Lindsay, hey, if I'm going to lift my game, what's good look like? And the challenge that was being articulated was that it's hard to point to good practices around trusteeship. The second area was that how then do I tell my co-trustees that things need to change? And when I thought about that second piece, or the second plank there, the problem was not only about what does good look like, but it's also how do we go about selling the value proposition of what a good independent trustee brings to the table. So it's with those two things in mind that I developed this framework, which I'm going to share with you today. Kevin, if you could just turn the slide. First off, I want to just sort of share. We're getting a bit of feedback there, but I'll box on. First off, I just wanted to share put some trusteeship in a little bit of context. In recognising those challenges exist with independent trustees, it's important to understand why they arise. And part of the challenges I see with trusteeship, if we think about the context of the service and what we do for people, is that there's some inherent complexities associated with it. And with that complexity comes risk. Clients need good trustees at their sides, but it's important to recognise that it's not always an easy job. In my view, it takes a bit of courage and fortitude. A lot of the time that I see being spent with trustees is trying to get alignment with their co-trustees, their trust beneficiaries, but also the advisors that are associated with the trust, so that there's a focus on collaboration. And that alignment, the effort put in there, it's all around the relationships that exist and that are inherent within a trust. And that when it's happening well, you get harmony, and that's a good thing. I've found in 40 years that I still strike things that I've never struck before. And in some ways, that's where you're going to the table as a trustee, and you don't always know what's going to happen next, or whether you're going to be in a situation that you've never had to deal with before. In my view, trusteeship is very much a decision-making role. And part of the challenge there is that, some of the decisions we're required to make as trustee aren't always easy. There's no obvious answer. And often there's an element of pressure that's added into the situation, or there are tensions with some of those relationships that I mentioned earlier. And that's why, in many ways, trusteeship is dealing with shades of grey rather than, the things aren't always black and white. The final comment I'd make is that each trust is different. There's a little bit of art there. It's no situation is the same, and it's how we as independent trustees bring together the rules that are there, the relationships that we're involved in, and the property to orchestrate outcomes in line with the purposes when the trust creator set the trust in place. So with those things, they certainly add to the challenge of trusteeship, but it also makes the role varied, interesting, and I think it's a role that is very worthwhile, and that how you serve as a trustee becomes very important. And it's, for one final comment there, is that it really has to connect with you. And the good trustees really understand what I mean by that comment. Right, let's get into it, Kevin. With the stewardship framework, that originally, as to how that evolved, it was to address those two questions that I mentioned. What's good look like, and then how do I articulate the proposition of having an independent trustee at the table? Now, this is a broad and generic framework. What we're looking at here is 8 sectors, which I'll unpack during the course of this webinar. I see it, while we're talking today, very much from a trustee perspective. These concepts, I think, can apply generically across any fiduciary appointment, whether you're acting for someone under an appointment during their lifetime, or it could be as trustee in in that sort of role. So it's all about this relationship. This framework is what I call it my stewardship framework, and it acts across those appointments. The 8 areas are a bit like rooms in a house. That's the way I describe them. You know, that you can move from one area to another at will. They are connected, and it just is it's an area. Well, the idea of a framework is that these 8 areas, places that you can review a trustee appointment from. It gives you 8 areas to think from when you're working as a trustee, but also it helps communicate all the work that's involved in being a trustee. On the left-hand side, we've got the orange areas, which the governing terms are the rules. You've got the relationships we've spoken about, and also the property. So that's the core parts of a trust. On the right-hand side in blue is really about the how. What's the trustee's policy for doing stuff? How does a trustee operate and administer the trust? There's also a financial component with which pulling together the financial statements. I've got in there a dotted line to the client's affairs. And when you're acting as a steward, as a trustee or a steward for someone during their lifetime, often there's a connection back to the trust creator's affairs and the role that trust has to play. And it's important to consider both areas, and I'll explain that a bit later as we get on. But the idea behind the framework, it's there to review from, to think from, and to communicate from. Let's have a look at a bit more detail there, Kevin. At a detailed level, we start seeing the components that support each of those 8 headings. And these are the things that trustees need to be thinking about and doing at different points during the course of their appointment. Now, I mentioned I use this as a tool in different ways. I generally have this, for example, slide on the table when I'm holding a trustee meeting, and I'd give a copy of the people that were in the room, whether they be co-trustees, the trust creator, or the beneficiaries. I print it at an A3 size, and I find it really useful to have the conversation. It's also a review tool that I can, if I've reviewed the trust appointment, just to reacquaint myself with it. It helps me identify areas that I might put an asterisk beside, just to highlight an area that I want to have a conversation about with the people that I'm meeting with. But all of it, if you're thinking from an education side, when people see it, what I've found is that, particularly beneficiaries or co-trustees, they recognise, crikey, there's a lot of things that trustees need to be thinking about and doing. And that helps really articulate that value proposition of what a good independent trustee brings to the table. And that reinforces that leadership role that I mentioned earlier, that I see the independent trustees having a role of being able to lift practices and standards and keep people that they're working with, help with the alignment and ensure that they're considering everything they need to be thinking about. So that's at a high level. So Kevin, let's start unpacking it. And the first one we'll look at is the governing terms. Now, when I'm reviewing a trust, I recommend that you always go back and reference the governing terms. You may have read it often once when you first took on an appointment, but it's important to reacquaint yourself with the governing terms frequently. I've put up the top clearly there, purpose. Purpose gives context for how the trust is to be run. I find here a lot of trusts have been established and the purpose isn't always clear, either in the documents or with what the trust creator's wishes are not always expressed. And that's one of the first points that always to look at. And that's about understanding what's the trust for and how is it expected to enhance the lives of the beneficiaries that are named within it. You'll hear, I mentioned earlier that this framework can be used for a variety of different types of appointments, whether it's a trust or a will or a power of attorney or a court order. Those are all documents giving the authority to act and contain often the terms of the appointment. So it's important that you're familiar with those and understand any particular nuances or wrinkles that involved in those documents. Really important as well to ensure that you've correctly interpreted the documents so that there's no breach in what you're undertaking. I've added there the trust creator's wishes as part of the governing terms. Now, I mentioned earlier trusteeship is a decision-making role, and while a trust creator can't bind trustees with their wishes, they are an important document that when you're making decisions, you can reference them. And that's a document, there's an opportunity to consider a number of things, and while not binding, you can take them into account as part of your decision making as a trustee and give them due consideration. Importantly, you know, where things can change over the course of the trust, provided that it's consistent with the original purposes and the terms, those wishes can be updated from time to time. And often we think about those documents as expressing the set laws or the trust creator's wishes, but as a trustee, we also need to think about, do they give us the indication there or some of the things that we may need as a trustee as part of our decision making? And that's something to consider further as well. So the governing terms are really about the rules, the authority, and the scope. So we'll just go on to that next slide there and look at relationships. Now, in a trust, beneficiaries have to be on top of the pole. That's what trusts are all about, and it's important that we have a really good understanding of their needs, circumstances, expectations, and also where they live or their residencies, because those sort of things may impact the distributions or the tax considerations that we need to think about as beneficiaries. But trusts very much are all about relationships, and there I've listed some of the people that we are required to have relationships with. Relationships can add complexity to a trustee appointment, and if you hear of problems in trusts, often it stems from misaligned expectations or sometimes entitlements. You know, it just depends. But we have to think about, when we think about relationships, where there are other trustees working with us as an independent trustee, how do we work together and what sort of relationships are there? Beneficiary relationships between trustees and beneficiaries, have we got alignment of interests? But there's also other people where you might have a minor beneficiary, you may be dealing with a guardian for a minor, or there could be a welfare guardian representing a beneficiary's interests. We've also got other advisors, and I mentioned earlier on how we collaborate there, and depending on the property that you hold as a trustee, sometimes you're required, I've just put there as a bit of a prompt, tenants, lessees, especially, you know, into real estate. So relationships are how we work together, thinking about who benefits and who also understanding who holds the controlling powers. Next slide there, Kevin. Now, trustees have a role of caring for the property that they've been given responsibility for. And when we hold property over long periods of time, it's important that we act as a good steward, and we have, you know, we identify the property we're responsible for, that we marshal it, get it under our control as trustees. Security is something we need to be thinking about, both in, you know, for example, insurance purposes, as to, you know, is the property being maintained and insured? The maintenance there, where what's coming up, we need to be thinking forward. We need to understand which assets may be, you know, have higher degrees of risk. For example, if you've got a vacant property as part of a trust, as part of a portfolio of assets, you know, that may, because of the nature of the vacancy, it may add or increase the risk that's involved. Other risks that can come around property, thinking about who's actually occupying it and how are they caring for it. And so things like inspections and that are quite important roles as part of the trustee. And the idea here with having property here is it's just a prompt to think about those sort of things that I've just been mentioning. A trustee may have liabilities within the trust that they're responsible for the payment of. For example, it could be mortgages, it could be guarantees, that sort of thing. And some of those are onerous, and it's important that we have oversight of them and they're under our control. Gifting's mentioned there because initially there has to be a gift of assets into the trust, and that's just a reminder there to understand if there is, for example, a gifting program or if there are gifting implications, just to consider those there. And the importance there is that we find here often is that sometimes it's not always clear if assets have been gifted into trust or still part of a loan owing back to the trust creator. And if they haven't been documented correctly or properly, that can sometimes lead to confusion at a later date. So the idea here is that because we hold assets over long periods of time, it's really important that we've got control of the property and thinking about the type of assets we've got. Sometimes we're asked to hold unusual items. It could be stamp collections, could be gold, could be art, and they all have their particular nuances. Things that we need to be thinking about as being a good steward and ensuring that we can demonstrate the degree of care that's required for those things. Next slide there, Kevin. We're starting here to look on the right-hand side, and that's about, as mentioned earlier, the how we operate as a trustee. I've put in here policy. Now, policy is often in trustees' heads. In larger trusts, it's documented. It's not uncommon to see an investment policy, for example, documented, where we're working with an investment advisor. Distribution is a policy that we need to be thinking about and why we're doing and how we're doing it, especially if we've got fixed entitlements, for example, between income beneficiaries and also balancing the rights of the beneficiaries who will benefit at the end of a life tenant's entitlement. But we've also sometimes got discretionary distributions in trust where we as trustees can make distributions based on our discretion. So what is our policy around how we're going to approach as trustees those sorts of things? I've put terms of engagement there as a prompt to think about where we engage advisors, and that the sort of things that you'd be thinking about there is how are advisors appointed to be advisors for the trust? How's it been documented? What is their terms of engagement and scope? But also to remind us to review those terms of engagement periodically as to how those advisors are performing. Conflicts of interest are inherent in trusts, and for those, I'd recommend that think about where someone can sometimes be a trust creator and a beneficiary. We need to understand what hats people are wearing at different times. They may also be a beneficiary as well as a family member, and that may add to particular tension. So conflicts are inherent and part of trusteeship. Information release is something to consider, and that's thinking as a trustee about when do we notify people, for example, as beneficiaries that they are a beneficiary of the trust, especially if they're a minor or it's going to depend from trust appointment to trust appointment. There's a second piece to that as well, and it's also thinking about when do trustees, how do they respond to requests from beneficiaries for the information, for information or further information. It's all part of trustee decision making, but it's something that's quite important because at the end of the day, trustees are accountable to beneficiaries, and trustees have to release enough information to enforce the terms of the trust. risk is there as a reminder. Is there a risk policy? And it's going to depend. It could be the nature of the assets. Risk could be as a result of the complexity or the nuances, the terms of the appointment, the detail in the trust deed. It could come from just contentious situations from a relationship perspective. So it's how we think of managing risk, and there's really two main types, those associated within the appointment, but there's also an element of how we conduct ourselves as trustees, because if we're not on top of things, that can add to our risk personally as part of a trustee appointment. So that's the policy section. If we get on to procedure. Now, procedure is thinking about, excuse me, really as trustees, how we work together. This is about the interfaces of how we make decisions, where you've got co-trustees alongside you as an independent trustee, how you come to the table to review the trust appointment and think forward from a planning perspective as trustees, how you report to stakeholders that are associated with the trust, how you meet, how you educate, especially if you're working with non-professional trustees. And I'd highly recommend those last two items, planning and education, become agenda items at trustee meetings. So I'm strongly of the view, as I mentioned earlier, that professional independent trustees have got a leadership role, and often that's around where they're working with non-professional trustees or family members. It's almost a mentoring role. It's a teaching role and educating people on how trusts work and how the appointment is required, what practices trustees are required to undertake, and it's facilitating decisions, outcomes in line with the purposes. So procedure I see as a really good place to think from when it comes to meetings and setting expectations on how trustees work together. Next slide there, Kevin. Trustees are required to often operate over long periods of time, and part of that is really important to ensure the records of the trust are maintained. It may be that there's a group of trustees or a trustee takes on the role at the outset and hands over the reins to incoming trustees, say 10 to 15 years later, who then are responsible for carrying on the terms of the trust. Trustees have to then assemble and retain those records, hand them over, or ensure they're available. So the administration is really about the record keeping for the trust and keeping things in good order during the life of the trust. Core information that you need to be on top of is making sure that you can access, the deeds or the original source documents outlining the rules, the trust creator's wishes, having a list of property, maintaining financial records during the course of the trust, having documents confirming who's been appointed or who's retired as a trustee. But it's also the records of decisions that trustees have made. And I firmly recommend that that those records are centralized. We've got some really good electronic systems that trustees can use these days for pulling all the records together in a centralized repository and making sure they're accessible to trustees. The other reason this is important is because sometimes trust decisions can be challenged. And I recall a situation, where a trust decision was challenged about 20 years after the decision had been made. The professional independent trustee at the time the decision made worked with the non-professionals, but those non-professionals weren't living. They were family members, and they weren't living when the decision was made. It was the grandchildren that came back and tried to have a go. There was an investment that caused a problem, and there was a loss of money, and the trustee was protected because they could access records 20 years earlier and produce them, which showed the considerations that they took into account, the advice that was obtained, the consultation that took place with family members. And that's where, if you're a trustee and you're having to, you're being challenged on a decision that was made sometime earlier, you're not always going to remember the detail. And so I can't stress strongly enough, especially with significant decisions, that you keep those records and make sure that they are available for the future if they are challenged. Don't rely on your memory. And the other point I'd make is have good diary systems, know where the original documents are, and make sure that you've cited them, that they're secure. And also think about, as a final comment around administration, is just the practice of really good file notes, or having a journal that you take to meetings, which records your understanding of what was agreed. Going back to diary there, just think there about the milestones that occur in a trust. One of the points that independent trustees can help with is they think forward, think long term. You've got coming up in the future, it could be a minor of age, turns 25, for example, or 20 years of age when they become an adult and entitled to a trust distribution. Make sure that you've got a record for it. The expiry of leases, rent reviews that you may have for property, real estate that's under your responsibility, distribution dates, having a diary record for when the trust is due to expire, if it's set for a particular time. All good practices for trustees. Kevin, finance, let's look at that. Now, one of the things that adds to the complexity of a trust often is the cash transactions. Having cash transactions, that are flowing through for receipts and payments, it can really add time and complexity. And it's important we've got procedures and protocols to ensure those sorts of things are kept under our control. Financial statements should be prepared annually, and so that's just good accounting practice. Taxation can add complexity as well, with making sure, and also risk, to make sure that we meet both the filing dates. We've got processes to ensure tax returns are filed and tax liabilities are paid when due. I mentioned earlier as well that sometimes as a trustee we have to account for income separately from capital. So what are the mechanisms we've got in place to do that? And where bank accounts are associated with a trust, as a trustee, what are the controls and mechanisms that we're going to use to ensure that we've got appropriate oversight? We know who's operating accounts, or if it's not ourselves, making sure private assets aren't intermingled with trust assets, and that those bank accounts and cash transactions are all being managed for the proper purposes, in line with the purposes for the trust. These really are the 7 areas now that we've covered. The 3 in orange around the rules, the relationships and property, and then the 4 blue ones are really about the how we go about and act as a trustee. And we've described some of the policy, procedures, administration and financial requirements which will keep us in good stead. So if we go to the next slide, Kevin, thanks, is that as an independent trustee, or often the trust creator has their own affairs that we need to be thinking about as well, and ensure that they're in alignment. Some of the things, for example, is that if the trust creator has loaned money to the trust and not gifted it, and that's given the trust assets that the trustees can manage, how's that loan intended to be dealt with on the trust creator's death? That's something, for example, making sure that, I recommend, if you're a trustee, getting a copy of the trust creator's will to ensure that there is alignment. if the trust has been created for asset protection, for example, and there's no point that with the trust creator still continuing to accumulate assets in their own name if they've got exposure to particular risks that they're trying to protect through the use of a trust. Understanding how those assets outside trust are held, it's not going to be applicable in every case, but it's important to give that consideration from time to time to ensure that there is alignment. Thinking also about the role of philanthropy, there could be a charitable trust that we're responsible for managing, and ensure that we have conversations with the trust creator at regular intervals as to how things are going. So this section just is really a reminder to consider if there is there can be an impact on the trustee appointment, and ensuring there's harmony and alignment where that's required with the trust creator or the client's affairs. Next slide, Kevin. So we've come back to the full framework, and as I said earlier, that this is something that is a place to help review trusts from, that I've found useful to help. It's certainly helped me when I'm operating as a trustee from a decision-making perspective, or in a meeting, that it's a place I can think from, and it also helps me communicate. I've used it as a tool to communicate a lot of the value that a trustee provides. Trusteeship, if people don't always see everything that as an independent trustee we're required to be thinking about and doing, and it starts showing that, hey, there's a lot of things that trustees need to be managing, and this helps communicate, as I mentioned, that value proposition for an independent trustee. So again, it's a high-level framework. There may be areas that may have been missed, that haven't been included, that are important in your whatever jurisdiction you're in, and I'll welcome feedback and comments for that. And I'm happy to share a copy of the framework. All I ask is that there's appropriate attribution and no changes are made. But my email address is on the next slide if you show that, Kevin, and people are welcome to contact me, and I'm happy to email a copy of that slide. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Over to you, Kevin.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay. I'm going to unmute everybody's lines now. I don't have any questions right at the moment in the chat box, but we'll see. Go ahead. Everyone is unmuted now, so if you do have a question, go ahead.
Vraag.
All right. Okay. Well, we will make this recording available to all of the attendees and everyone who's registered for this event. If you do have any final questions, if you want to put those in the chat box, or if you would like to email Lindsay directly, you have his contact information. And I'll just remind you that this has been the first of 2 complimentary webinars, and please send any feedback to us. We'd like to hear your thoughts on this topic or future topics that you would like discussed. Our next webinar will be in June. The topic will be announced soon. And for more information, of course, visit trusteealliance.com, where you can find more information about the Trustee Alliance and membership inquiries. Okay, I do see one question coming in here, so let's address this before we leave. This is from Fia in South Africa. Lindsay, which systems do independent trustees typically use to take care of the administration and accounting? And I think I've got you muted, Lindsay. One moment. Go ahead, Lindsay.
It's hard for me to answer that question because there are a number, and I couldn't tell you which typically people use. It's going to depend. I think the thing when you're looking at systems, and there are a number that are available, is to think about is cash going to be, does it need to be managed within the system? And if you think of a number of large trustee corporations, they would have some legacy systems at that level. For a lot of New Zealand trustees, we use a system called ConnectWorks here in New Zealand, and that is an online system which assists just with curating the records over in a centralized repository and helping with document signing, that sort of thing. But I think it's important when you look at those systems to consider the local jurisdiction and see if there is one locally that will assist.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Matt McClintock. What issues have you encountered in dealing with digital assets, particularly Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies in trust administration?
I'll be straight up here and say that I haven't had to deal with those particular assets like the cryptocurrencies in any trust that I've been administering at this point in time. I'm aware it's on the radar for many trustees, so I'm not in a position to answer that one. But there, just if you think about any digital assets, it has there is additional complexity, and the challenge there would be getting control of those assets as a trustee. That would be the first step. But yeah, I'm not in a position to give detail on that particular question. I'm sorry, Matt.
Okay. So follow up for Matt. We're using BitGo for a custodial account we're helping with. So that's worth a look. BitGo. I know Matt's up in Colorado, and I'm not seeing any other comments at this time. Again, you have Lindsay's contact information. Please feel free to contact him directly. I thank you all very, very much for making the time. I know for some of you this is at an off time, late in the day or very early in the day, and we appreciate you spending some time with us. And again, please send your feedback. We would love to hear from you, and we look forward to presenting for you again in June. So thank you, everyone, and have a productive week.